Hey, thank you for checking out the DDT Method podcast. My name is Drew Donaldson, and today I'm sitting down once again with Dr. Dean St. Mart. The last time Dean was on the show a couple months ago was one of those episodes that really contributed to putting this show on the map and leading to our tremendous explosion in popularity that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. Dean, thank you for your time once again, and thank you for an amazing interview. This is another one that I think you guys are really going to love and listen to 2 or 3 times because Dean gives you, as always, a ton of actionables that you can incorporate directly into your training program, regardless of what your goals are. Dean is, of course, a highly educated and highly respected individual that contributes to the world of performance enhancement, as well as the bodybuilding and health and fitness worlds in general. Ladies and gentlemen, this is my second sit down with Dr. Dean St. Mart. Hey guys, full disclosure, this is kind of a commercial. I want to talk to you really quickly about the DDT Method School Group. Social media is getting weird these days. On Instagram, on YouTube, on really any platform, anytime I mention anything that sounds like milligram or protocol, I tend to get some sort of warning or red flag or even temporarily banned. So just to avoid that and still to be able to give you guys the information that you want, I started the DDT Method School Group. 2 days per week, I'll be dropping content from multiple different angles, exclusive videos, exclusive podcasts, exclusive articles, all this information that I put together, giving you guys protocols, dosages, and in-depth profiles of your favorite peptides and PEDs. That's the DDT Method School Group. Click the link below. Welcome back to the DDT Method podcast. I am here once again with Dr. Dean St. Mart. You guys have been asking to have him back on the show literally for months since we had him on for the first time. It was one of our most popular, if not our most popular episode. And luckily, Dean has so much information floating around his brain, we could probably record about 50 of these before we even had to settle on a specific topic. So we don't need to do the whole intro song and dance again. You guys are watching this. You know who Dean is. Dean, I'm just more interested in what you've been working on recently, because I've seen you posting a lot of stuff about your biological age. So can you tell us a little bit about that and what you've been working on?
Drew, I guess what started out as a friendly competition between me and my wife, you can do a biological age based off how glycated your blood is. So obviously when people do blood work, one of the markers that we check is HbA1c or glycated hemoglobin. And so what you're measuring there is effectively how much glucose has gone onto your red blood cells. And glycation is a natural process that happens every day where we glycate or stick sugar onto a protein, which can serve as a cell signaling process or as a defense mechanism. And with glycans, or putting sugar onto proteins, what we're able to track there is I guess in theory, how much oxidative stress has your body encountered in terms of your immune system, your metabolic function, your ability to use glucose, all these sort of really cool things. And there's a cool company now, this is like no affiliation, Glycan Age. I think they're a UK-based company. They have access in their lab to check different markers of your blood towards what has been glycated. And based off that, you then get a biological age versus the reference papers of how much of these glycans have been detected in your bloodstream. So when it came to mine and my wife's a year and a half older than me. So we were sort of like banking, like she was a bikini athlete, so she was a bodybuilder, and then when we had kids she retired from doing that competition and took up like more functional training, high rocks and CrossFit and everything else. So she eats healthily, but I wouldn't say she's like extremely regimented versus when she was a competitor, and her use of like supplements and everything wouldn't be as broad as what I'd do. So it was sort of like an interesting thing around like genetics and what I do to support my genetics versus hers. And it ended up being a tie. Both of us were a biological age of 10 years below our physical age. So for me, it came back at 27. For her, it came back at 29. So with that in mind, then it sort of gives you an idea into aging processes. So one of the main drivers of aging we're starting to see is obviously DNA damage or cellular replication defects, where you run out of, I guess, the end cap of your chromosomes where your DNA is, your telomeres, they shorten over time. And now the chromosome is open to being attacked. And then once the chromosome is attacked, the genetics inside is defective and the cell in theory can no longer divide. So with that in mind, when we're looking at like longevity strategies, we're trying to protect the telomeres. So that's where people do strategies like telomerase strategies, astragalus extracts, so astragaloside 4, epithalon. There's all these certain strategies that might help to elongate the telomere, buying you time on how the cell's able to divide. So effectively, what ends up with us dying is, unfortunately, the cells of a specific organ just run out of replication space, where at your heart, kidneys, lungs, and then you sort of die of old age. You can't continue that replicative process. You've got a lot of biohackers looking at this longevity space of, well, we could probably cheat this biology by extending the telomere length, by slowing down how frequent or how often our cells replicate. And this is sort of where, when we look at bodybuilders, why quite often their physical appearance looks a lot more aged than their actual biological or physical age, if you want to not get mixed up. So you could have a 32-year-old looking like their late 40s because of, when we are consistently in that anabolic state, that mTOR state, our cells are continuously dividing and replicating, so they're aging. So the whole process of anti-aging is slowing down cellular replication or slowing down that process. The sort of aside to all that then is oxidative stress. So we touched on the mitochondria sort of optimization the last time. A lot of the diseases of aging are now starting to be associated with mitochondrial dysfunction. So say, for example, heart disease. We're now looking at the cardiomyocytes becoming dysfunctional, potentially because of the energetics in the mitochondria not working properly, or too much oxidative stress where the cell has become damaged. And interestingly, when you have a myocardial infarction or a heart attack, what actually happens is your body sends a ton of mitochondria to your heart to keep you alive. So it shows you how intelligent these symbiotic organelles are to, first and foremost, try and keep themselves alive, but do it by keeping you alive. So if we can come at it from the angle of slowing down cellular replication, whether that is with periods of fasting or not having chronic high caloric intake periods, so not being afraid to have that rest and digest where you're maybe having a 24 or 48 hour fast. Looking at protein restriction or methionine restriction is another thing that people do, where you specifically limit some of the amino acids like methionine or leucine to slow down muscle protein synthesis and aging as a consequence. And then looking at strategies of improving antioxidant health, all that sort of good stuff we talked about before. Glutathione, CoQ10, making sure you have adequate carnitine for shuttling fatty acids into our cells. I don't think, biological age, when I delved into my genetics in my mid-20s, when I was getting into bodybuilding, that came as a personal aside of, there was a few things that ran through our family history that I was sort of curious about. On one side, there was a familial history of depression. So to me, that made sense. When I looked at my genetics, it started to make sense, and that we had issues with MAOA, which is the enzyme that breaks down serotonin. So inherently, we have a very fast running MAOA, so that burns through serotonin or clears serotonin out very quickly. And then there's some things surrounding like drug metabolism, why certain drugs need higher dosages, and especially with, say, for example, my mother. So tying all that sort of genetic aspect in my 20s, it was sort of like, well, if you know you have these risks early on, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're fated to have the disease. And I guess aside from the depression, the other thing that came up in my genetic deep dive was that we carry 2 copies of ApoE4, which puts you at very high risk of Alzheimer's. And it made sense why, again, my grandparents and some of my uncles have developed a level of dementia because of when you carry 2 of these genetic variants, you are pretty much at, I think it's 60 to 70% high risk of developing amyloid plaques as you get older because of ApoE being the lipoprotein that deposits cholesterol and plaque into the brain. Having those genetics doesn't necessarily mean, for example, myself, that I'm going to end up with these cognitive defects, that I'm fated to have Alzheimer's. If I understand ways of controlling ApoE, if I control oxidative stress and making sure that the cholesterol that I am transporting or depositing isn't becoming oxidized, that my omega-3 to 6 ratio is optimal. All of these things, knowing that risk, genetics comes at a high cost of, can you accept what the answers show? Like, do you have paralysis by analysis? Having high risk of Alzheimer's, do you live like the next 40 years of, oh, whatever, I'm going to end up with Alzheimer's anyway, and you just don't do any strategy to offset it? Or you see it as a challenge of, if I do everything optimally, I eat a healthy, nutritious diet, I supplement with some omega-3 fatty acids, maybe some BDNF strategies, whether that is mental tasks or skill acquisition or things like lion's mane or, other compounds that are used for improving neurogenesis, do I then offset that genetic risk? And so I've been fascinated ever since I got into bodybuilding about this sort of health span versus disease span, or making sure that all the years that you're living are to the best of your healthy ability, rather than the old model was you sort of got 60, 65 years of good health to speak, and then the next 20 years from, say, 65 to 85 were pharmaceutically induced, where you're sort of just buying time, but it's not high quality in terms of like a functional body, functional memory. You're using strategies just to prolong life rather than giving you quality life. So I think I'm very happy with where my biological age is, given that, I was a competitive bodybuilder for 10 years and all the little sort of risks we take with that. But as I said on a post recently on Instagram, like, health was always my number one priority. Like, if something impacted my health, then I had to make a very core decision on the risk of, is that worth what I'm going to do? And I think that was where I was lucky that I never wanted to be like an open level bodybuilder. I was happy to be sort of classic and have, a decent physique around 200 pounds without having to push beyond what I felt comfortable risk wise. And that's not to say what others are doing to achieve those goals is irresponsible. It's just, again, risk tolerance and where your own personal ethics lie in your future health.
I agree with that 1,000%. And I think having that like small amount of being cognizant about the risks we're taking, why we want to take these risks. I have conversations with people, clients, consultees all the time. And I explain that I feel that my personal belief, at least, is that you need to assess risk versus reward based on the individual and based on what the actual reward is, not just based on I want this or I don't want this. Does somebody have the potential to actually make a lot of money in social media or in bodybuilding or in some way, shape, or form based on having a ridiculous cartoonish physique, versus do they just want that because they just broke up with their ex-girlfriend and they're mad about it and they think, for lack of better logic, that that's going to get them a bunch of girls, which we all know it doesn't do. Lots of attention from guys, but nonetheless, it's always assessing that individual like reasoning why they're doing that. So I'm more prone in a coaching setting, I don't do that much coaching anymore, but to say, okay, we can we can push things a bit if somebody has the potential to do something to actually change their life for the better by achieving the goal that pushing will give them. But I came up in kind of a similar regard to you in that I was always very cognizant about it. Now, I like to say I became intelligent about it in my mid-30s. I wish it was earlier. But I always had kind of a mindset of like, let me get my blood work every 3 months. I want to be as big as possible, but let me check my blood pressure every couple days. Let me just keep an eye on all this. So I knew that I was never getting too far away from the point of no return, or too close to the point of no return, I should say. And then as I learned more and more, I started implementing these strategies to progress forward, but still, benefit my health with the mitochondrial supplements and whatnot. I recently got a gigantic panel of blood work done, and everything that was already pretty good got significantly better over the course of a year of utilizing things like GLPs and SLU and MOSI and 5-amino-1-MQ and SS31 all strategically. So there is hope, even if you have done some damage, to continue to progress and move forward. Now, something that we spoke about a little bit off air is people are kind of going too far in that regard. So it's very strange now that I'll speak to somebody that's coming to me for advice and I'll say, like, what are you taking right now? And then I get this massive fucking grocery list of more peptides than I've ever used in my entire life that they're using right now. And this is like a housewife that's like just trying to optimize health span. And I think we get caught up in the whole, hey, this is healthy, but we're looking at it in terms of like, hey, this is healthier than when we used to blast a bunch of tren. Like, this can be used responsibly to facilitate greater health. But that doesn't mean, neither of those things mean, we can just slam every single one of these products because somebody on the internet said that they're healthy and they'll increase lifespan and health span, et cetera, et cetera. How do we go about picking our path to optimization and figuring out what we need to use and why when it's so tempting and so easy to just take fucking everything?
Yeah, it's really, I felt recently some level of duty to speak out, as I don't want to be like the forefather of introducing all these mitochondrial peptides, sort of optimization to bodybuilding, but I guess from my own like N=1 experiment in 2024, and then speaking about it with Steve and Kurt, all of a sudden then Steve tried it, and then Steve was like, what have you sort of uncovered here? And then all of a sudden you got all these anecdotal reports of guys writing comments of, I tried your protocol and it's a game changer with my prep. Even back then, when I made like a decision, even with like SLU, you look at the human to animal equivalent dose for what they done with mice and injected into mice. Now, this is injected versus oral with humans. It comes out at about 4 milligrams per kilogram for a human, which for a 100 kilo male or 220 pound male is about 400 milligrams. When I was sort of then looking at what dose would I want to use, I started personally out of 100, then I went to 2, and then I went to 4, and then I went to 6. And then when I went to 6, I was like, there's no huge difference between 6 and 4. So I went back to 4. With that, I seen huge changes. And again, anecdotally, people see this with fatty acid oxidation. One of the primary drivers of SLU is that, in theory, with higher rates of fatty acid oxidation, we see an inhibition of pyruvate dehydrogenase, PDH, which is driven by another enzyme called PK4. PK4 switches off PDH, and now your body can't really use glycolysis to fuel pyruvate and acetyl-CoA into the Krebs cycle, so you use beta oxidation to feed it and feed the mitochondrial respiratory chain, which is amazing for fat loss. If you've got lipolysis and you're releasing fatty acids, and now the fatty acids are being burnt, and you couple that with other lipolytic strategies like mirabegron, GH, we're starting to get really intelligent here. Yeah, you burn through fatty acids, you get leaner, and as a consequence, your metabolic efficiency is probably leveraged that you can eat more food to maintain energy balance. But that, to me, at that dosage, even when you look at how many molecules is in 400 micrograms, It's like billion, trillion, quadrillion, whatever number it is. It's huge, which when you're looking at receptor interactions in the body, I wouldn't write that off as a, if that's 100% bioavailability, that's a lot of interactions. If we start to then say, okay, SLU can get hydrolyzed in your stomach, so it gets broken down, you lose a portion of the drug that way, kind of cross the gut wall into the bloodstream for hepatic first pass metabolism, the drug potentially has good uh, kinetics and it can cross over the gut wall. So it has what's called like Lipinski's rule of five dictates like a molecule is a certain molecular weight, it has a certain number of hydrogen bond donors and acceptors, and in theory has good coefficient partitioning. SLU fits that. So let's say, okay, small bit gets hydrolyzed at the stomach, gets into the gut, a good portion of it, say 60, 70% passes from your gut into your bloodstream. When it goes to the liver of SLU, it's got a phenol, which we know is quite reactive with liver metabolism. So you might lose another 40, 50% of the drug. So in theory, that very small dose could end up being not safe, but in terms of its metabolism, we're losing fractions of the drug. In saying that, as we're losing fractions of the drug, some of those metabolites could be carcinogenic or put a burden on our body to have to detox them. So even when we're looking at, a low dose versus a human equivalent dose, something just in terms of like anecdote of what people see with that low dose. The ones who question, let's even say 1 milligram as being a non-efficacious dose, you have to question, well, is what they're taking actually real and pure? And secondly, how efficient is their system to accommodate what benefits come from estrogen receptor related alpha and PGC1 alpha towards their mitochondria? Because if they are an oxidative stress mess, well, first off, their metabolic efficiency is going to be quite poor. They're going to have a lot of oxidative stress. They're not going to see these benefits that we see in an optimized setting. So now it comes back to, why are you taking it if all the basics beforehand aren't being optimized, like sleep, proper training, cardio, movement, micronutrients, CoQ10, all these basic things to support the body, B vitamins, and then start messing around with these things if there is good internal balance. I don't want to put it akin to like what happened with bodybuilding, but it's slowly becoming that way of if something is good in a small dose, well, let's take loads of it and it's going to be amazing. Yeah. And, even looking at Trenbolone, the data that we've done on Trenbolone, me and Steve, the human equivalent dose for like maximal occupancy of, say, the anabolic and glucocorticoid interaction, anti-cortisol effect was like 25 milligrams. When I done my prep and spoke about 40 milligrams, people were like, you're telling lies and this, that, and the other. And I'm literally going, well, we sat down and done the data and I put it to work. Does that mean, there's often arguments there, well, 200 milligrams is going to be a better dose than 40? Well, no shit in that you take more of a drug, you're going to get more interactions, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be more positive interactions. So now, in theory, you're seeing more benefits from a muscle mass perspective, but you're also seeing spillover onto neurons and your sleep quality, sweating, etc. That whilst with anything you take more of something, you get more effect, you get more side effects as well. You start going outside this therapeutic index. So with trying to change that paradigm, any competitor who has spoken to me and I've told them about what we've done on paper, some of them won't go in at 25 milligrams to be sort of like, I don't really want to, I'm on prep. I want to make sure that I'm doing everything as maximal as possible. Well, then you come to, a compromise. 50 milligrams is, double that 25 milligrams, but it's still, a quarter of 200 or 300 milligrams that you've minimized some level of risk from that excessive dose, but you're still seeing the anti-cortisol benefits or the sort of ensuring that you're getting the metabolic benefits of what Tren would bring in a contest prep without all the crazy side effects. And I guess it's slowly changing, and we're seeing more, I guess, biases being removed, where people then are, okay, we've had this sort of setup for 15, 20 years. It's brought great benefits, but there have also been some horrific case studies with nephrotoxicity, neurodegenerative decline. And, I've become known for speaking about it, but like neurodegenerative disease from anabolic steroid use is not something that you experience in your 20s. It's not like I take a load of Tren and next year I'm going to forget where I put my car keys. But you can be sure as hell that wherever you abuse in your 20s, you get your mid 40s. And now you start seeing those neural deficits where you start forgetting names, you start forgetting where you put your car keys, start forgetting all trivial things that, again, you sort of put off as meaningless, but they're telltale signs that your short-term memory is starting to become pretty shot. And so you have to really think about what you're doing in the short term, like, for example, SLU. If it does inhibit PDH, and we're now starving cells of being able to use glucose, that could be your brain cells or it could be your heart tissue. That in a trivial setting, if it's controlled with fatty acid oxidation in a small amount, can be a good thing. If we're inhibiting high amounts of PDH, where now cardiac cells and brain cells are being starved of glucose for a relative acute space of time that's meaningful, well, then you're going to see cell death. It's not going to be able to produce energy optimally. So in that case, again, with like heart disease or neural defects from using something like, say, high dose SLU, you're not going to see it like, same with cancer. Cancer doesn't just develop in 3 to 4 weeks. Cancer is a slow change in terms of what they believe now is mitochondrial dysfunction. The mitochondria become dysfunctional and the cell starts producing energy via other pathways. So they're now starting to look at a glutamine pathway or the Warburg hypothesis, where we start fermenting using lactate to produce energy inside the cell. So we're moving away from mitochondria and operating off a non-oxidative phosphorylation setting.
Hey guys, I hate commercials too, so I'm going to make this really, really quick. I just want to tell you about the DDT Method School Group. You see, social media has gotten really weird in recent years, and I keep getting red flagged or warned or blocked every time I mention anything that regards a milligram or a protocol or anything that seems like it's me giving you guys information on PEDs or anything related. Now, I'm not a medical professional. I'm not a doctor. This is for education purposes only, blah, 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 blah. But I want you to check out the DDT Method School Group, because in there, I can give you guys exclusive content, including protocols and in-depth profiles of all of your favorite PEDs and peptides, and I can give you guys the information that I can't give you on any other platform. That's the DDT Method School Group. Check the link out below. Now, if we were to approach some sort of risk mitigation for things like SLU, so let's use SLU as the specific example because it's what we're mainly talking about right now. With SLU's ability to enhance beta oxidation at the expense of using glucose, would it be beneficial to maybe facilitate training that's going to be higher demand on glucose? Because if I'm not wrong, I believe driving an immediate demand for rapid replenishment of ATP will bypass SLU's ability to favor beta oxidation, and then you get the greater utilization of all that intramuscular glycogen that you've been storing now the rest of the day by focusing on beta oxidation. So that said, in an era where everybody's talking about really high intensity but really low volume, long rest training for hypertrophy, which can be optimal for some, I'm not going to say that it's not, in a setting where using SLU, might it be beneficial to drive like glycogen demanding higher volume training so you're tapping into that glycogen and thus feeding your system with it, as opposed to just beta oxidation 24/7?
Yeah, I mean, that's it. When we're looking at what our muscle fibers use preferentially from a fuel perspective, and then obviously the demand of the workout itself and intensity wise, for most people, like you're saying here, even if we're doing high intensity, low volume, we still tend to sit around a more fatty acid oxidation fuel perspective with training. If they start moving more into more metabolically demanding workouts, like very high volume, high work set environment, you're going to probably switch over to some level of glycolysis to fuel or utilize that glycogen for energy turnover as opposed to fatty acids. Potentially, I think what I'm starting to think about with SLU is, and it probably makes sense anecdotally from what I observed, is that we know in theory it probably has a very rapid half-life, that it has a half-life of a couple of hours at most in terms of, like, say 6 or 7 hours after taking an oral dose, most of it's been cleared out of your body. With that in mind, then it probably makes sense that you leverage this. I hate the term like using compounds in a fasted environment like your him buying and things like that. But if we use it in that environment where coming out of sleep, we are in a fatty acid oxidation state from sleep, obviously, as we get a cortisol awakening response, adrenaline starts to kick in, and then we get the release of glucose to wake us up in line with our circadian rhythm. If we have something like SLU, which is then inhibiting PDH and PK4 activity, you're seeing that increase in fatty acid oxidation that you might leverage with something like growth hormone or growth hormone fragment or lipotropin. That then serves to improve the utilization of the fuel with like fasted cardio or staying fasted and doing steps or movement to utilize that energy, and then backing away from that compound for the rest of the day, rather than taking SLU every few hours, which is another pacing strategy that some people do, where they take 3 or 4 doses per day. Anecdotally, from what I saw from the data, was let's use this in a fasted state, do cardio, do some steps, and leverage that increased fatty acid oxidation ability. And then once the compound in theory is cleared from the body, if I took this, say, at 6 a.m. in the morning, 5:30 a.m. in the morning, by the time I trained that afternoon or evening at 3 p.m., 4 p.m., in theory, based on what we can assume on its half-life, a good portion of that has left the system. And so you're seeing still the increased mitochondrial upregulation aspect, but you're not seeing some of the PDH or PK4 activity. And so you're able to swap over to, if needs be, using glycolysis to reduce pyruvate and acetyl-CoA, or still continue to use fatty acids for beta oxidation and again feeding acetyl-CoA into the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain.
With the whole process of beta oxidation being much more stressful on the body, not that it's damaging, but it does produce a greater amount of ROS. Should people that are running SLU, be it at that time of the day or if they're doing the staggered all-day approach, which you're not recommending, regardless, should they be leveraging some of the antioxidant strategies that have been discussed, like we discussed on the last podcast? Should we be like hyper-focusing on those while running a course of SLU?
I mean, when you look at anything with the mitochondria, the more you make, the more oxidative stress in theory. And the more oxidative stress we're talking about is making superoxide, hydrogen peroxide. You're now having to put greater emphasis on glutathione peroxidase, GPX, or glutathione transferase, the main enzymes that are clearing out xenobiotics, or even GGT, which is helping with the recycling. So most people will look at GGT on blood work. Instantly, if you're leveraging something like SLU, a clear sort of indication that it's increased oxidative stress beyond what you're naturally supporting is GGT shooting up. GGT on average should really, when you look at the research, should sit around 15 to 20. When it's above 20, all-cause mortality, especially from cardiovascular disease, increases. So very easy. Someone might even comment on this video if they've done blood work and utilized SLU and you're not following the proper appropriate antioxidant strategies, you may actually see your GGT is shot up. And these are the things that people in theory are probably looking at blood work, not seeing any meaningful change. When I say meaningful, I mean things going into the red, because most people just look at blood and if everything's not in the red, oh, let's go for it. if your GGT is, let's say, 20 prior to SLU, and now it's gone up to 40, it's still going to be in the green on your blood work without that nuance of knowing about optimal GGT level. You're going to take that as something that is favorably in terms of like, nothing has changed, my blood work, there's no red markers. But if you're looking between the lines of what's changing functionally, that is telling you you put a big demand on glutathione to recycle in your body, which is, if unless you've had a bad illness, which does put glutathione demand up, could be a signal that what you've done with SLU is increased your demand for glutathione, whether that is directly from the mitochondria or indirectly from the compound itself and how it's metabolized by the body. It's just, I felt that I had to come out and speak about what we're seeing in the past with low dose has brought benefits that I don't want people to sort of associate me down the line of, oh, well, we talked about mitochondrial strategies, when to me it was almost like you wouldn't want to have it in line with, say, hormesis, where you're putting a bit of stress to get a positive change from the system, because that's not really what you're doing with SLU. But for me, it's sort of leveraging an enhancement of your biology without really taking the biscuit of, well, if that small amount is working brilliantly, let's throw in more of it. And it's like what you said. Everything starts off being, peachy. People think this is safe and that, when none, like, being bluntly honest, there is no human safety data for most of these peptides or small molecules. We are all the big N=1 experiment that, like what you spoke about, has to come from that person's own responsible decision.
Mm-hmm.
Someone
1000%.
Someone asked me recently in like an interview for a documentary series. They asked me if I had to, imply one rule to bodybuilding, what would be that one rule? And that took me off by surprise to have to think of one rule. But then it's sort of like I had an aha of, if I had to employ one rule on bodybuilding, and this is going to upset a lot of people, it would be that whatever decision you choose to do is your own decision, not some influencer's best practice or cycle. If you choose to take 1,000 milligrams of testosterone, you've chosen to take 1,000 milligrams of testosterone. Not because your coach said it, not because some guy in the 90s done it, because you responsibly accepted, I want to take 1,000 milligrams. And I guarantee if most people had that level of honesty to themselves, I'd say a lot of what they're doing is influenced, which can be a bad thing from a business and sales perspective. But from a health strategy perspective and being a responsible adult, you have to be in charge of those decisions, so that if something goes wrong, you can't just point the finger and go, oh, well, you said to take 400 milligrams of SLU. And it's like, hang on, you put the SLU in your mouth and swallowed it as a responsible adult. That has to be accepted by the person, that if they've followed these protocols and dosages, that they are 100% happy with doing that. That there's no influence, that someone's telling you it's safe, when someone could tell you it's safe to jump off a cliff. You might be lucky, 1% of people might survive, a 100-foot cliff jump by landing properly in the water, but most people probably break their legs. Someone tells you it's safe, do you listen to them jumping off the cliff? Probably not. You'd look and logically think, don't like the chances here jumping.
It's funny because it's like you look at it now, and I compare it, and I'm making myself sound old just saying it, but I compare it to looking at the generation now that's never known life without an iPhone or without some sort of tablet or without some sort of smart device. I remember my first coach, I want to say it was like 2006. It was Fakhri Mubarak. I remember emailing him at an AOL.com email, so that in and of itself puts a date on all of it. And this was at a time when there were like 8 or 9 coaches total that people knew about. And working with a coach was not that common of a thing. Now we're in a time where you go to any regional level bodybuilding show, and if somebody's like, oh, I'm just self-coached, everybody else looks at that guy or girl like they're a lunatic, because there's just so many coaches. It's a thing that's accepted. This is what you do. And it's so funny because you talk to anybody, like you walk up to anybody with a microphone and a camera at a bodybuilding show, go to the Olympia, go to the expo, and just say, hey, are there more good coaches or bad coaches? They'll say bad. Are there more good coaches or bad coaches? Everybody will universally agree, and everybody will be the first to volunteer the information that, yeah, a lot of people just do one show and they're a coach, or they read a few Instagram reels and they're a coach. But then it's probably these same people that will get a plan that will say, take this, and they'll just say, okay, and they'll do it. As opposed to, I always took the approach of, here's what I think we should leverage based on what I know and based on what you've done before. Please research these and let me know if you're comfortable with it. And if I get an immediate, yeah, let's go for it response, I'm like, you didn't read anything about it. So talk to me in 2 or 3 days. Let's have that conversation. But people just don't want to do that. And now going into SLU and really all the mitochondrial supplements, we're doubling down on the danger of that, because there's this general consensus that the steroids are bad, but these are the good things and they're safe. So let's just dive right in and do it. And now we're starting to see that might not be the case. So for the person that might have been on this high dose of SLU or extremely long duration SLU, because the main goal for everybody seems to be, let's stay Instagram lean, and I want to be shredded 24/7, and I want great energy, and I want to be healthy, and I want to enhance my lifespan and my health span and all this stuff. And they're just now watching this and saying, well, oh crap, maybe I can't just leverage SLU all year in a high dose. What are some of the other options? If we're coming off of SLU, what can we utilize if we want to utilize something? Of course, we have to have that foundation of intelligent dietary strategies, times of higher calories, times of lower calories, training and programming, maybe being in different energy stimulus types at different times of the year. Those foundations have to be there. But what are some of our other options to drive processes like AMPK, or to maybe lean into mTOR for a little while for the person that's been perennially stuck in an AMPK stimulus for 3 years, thinking it's optimal, but achieving no balance? Like, how do we navigate these waters?
Yeah, like that is a really good question, because I guess, like you sort of hinted there, even when I was bodybuilding and I was at my, peak size, for me, it's nothing glorious to write home about, but like my peak at 238, which for me, for my classic cutoff was like, your classic cutoff's 192. You're getting a bit too far away from this cutoff. I even had periods of like fasting during the off season where I'd not eat anything for 24 or 36 hours, just knowing that eating 900 or 1,000 grams of carbs every single day, digestion. And obviously back then I was celiac without even knowing it. That was just something that made sense for me to take the pedal off the gas in terms of like mTOR, and swapping over to AMPK and swapping over to processes like autophagy and mitophagy, which obviously occur naturally anyway when people are like, oh, well, I'm doing a fast to improve autophagy and everything else. Your body does it naturally. It's just that when you're in an AMPK environment, cell signaling completely changes to mTOR. So now you're more focused on, well, where does energy need to actually go to in the body from our own energy sources? If we're trying to figure out ways to, like, I wouldn't say naturally elevate, but what are other strategies? Like what you touched on there, like high intensity cardio is one way of actually leveraging more mitochondria. So you improve oxidative phosphorylation, you improve mitochondria density, especially in your legs. And then obviously when we improve mitochondria density, like what I said about a heart attack, once you build extra mitochondria density in a certain area of the body, they're free to move around. It's not that mitochondria that are built in your leg stay in your leg. They're fascinating in that they can translocate, they can fuse, they can undergo fission where they split in two and send two mitochondria in two different directions. if we're looking at like even strategies towards like improving nutritionally, PQQ is a compound that has existed for decades, and it's termed a pseudo vitamin, but it helps provide one of the signals to improve mitochondrial biogenesis. So that can be a nutritional strategy that you implement. At one point, it was even patented with how successful it was. Ubiquinone versus ubiquinol, another sort of rabbit hole where if you're under the age of 40, you look at the research, the enzyme that does the reduction of ubiquinone to ubiquinol is quite efficient up to the age of 40. So if you're below the age of 40, ubiquinone can make sense as a supplement rather than spending more money on ubiquinol. Ubiquinol obviously has better bioavailability in terms of it's there at the step that the body uses at the mitochondria, but you should be capable of producing it from ubiquinone. Looking at what feeds the mitochondrial respiratory chain, the electron transport chain. Complex 1 uses vitamin B1. Complex 2 uses vitamin B2. Complex 3 uses CoQ10. And complex 4 relies on copper and iron. They're very simple things that need to be balanced. And obviously, complex 1 is fed NAD, complex 2 is fed FAD, and these are the things that undergo the redox to generate the electrons along the chain. Something as simple as looking at your thiamine intake. Most bodybuilders, like if we have a very high carbohydrate intake, our requirement for thiamine, vitamin B1, to support complex 1 massively increases, but it's a B vitamin that is underutilized, whether that is benfotiamine or TTFD. These are little things that you can do nutritionally to support the mitochondria without actually playing around with mitochondrial numbers. You're effectively giving in the substrates that make those complexes work naturally. Other strategies, I guess, if we look at very basics like carnitine, pyruvate intake, looking at phosphate and phosphate within the diet, like simple things again that we underappreciate can have a big impact over onto then the cellular health.
Would you say that in a situation where somebody's been using a ton of mitochondrial peptides and just different interventions, would something like you were saying to feed these complexes of the electron transport chain almost be the post-cycle, so to speak, for something like this? Maybe something like a 5-amino-1-MQ to increase NAD with a B complex like you have at supplement needs with your PQQs and CoQ10s added in together. Would that almost be the post-cycle therapy for mitochondrial supplementation?
I think, yeah, you've made a good analogy there. I guess this is where, like, when someone uses, say, injectable NAD, and injectable NAD is sort of marketed as this fountain of youth, like NMN, NOR, and all you're doing is feeding into complex 1. But if you like boatload complex 1, complex 2, which is next to it, which uses FAD and B2, has to pick up the slack. So you've just bolted a load of electron donors into complex 1. Complex 2 needs more B2. Complex 3 needs more CoQ10. You see, like what I sort of speak about with SLU, MOSI, you get this big increase in that you throttle things hard. But then for most people, if they don't do all these supportive strategies, you start going the other way. You start creating more pollution and dysfunction than benefit. So you definitely, when you're playing around with mitochondria, antioxidants aside, you have to look at the TCA or the Krebs cycle. You have to look at how you're feeding that. You have to look at the complexes of the electron transport chain. There are some really cool tests. It's sort of on my budget list to do, which is Mitome. And Mitome does a genetic analysis on your mitochondria. And then it gives you an efficiency score for each complex 1, 2, 3, 4. And then obviously how well number 5 is producing ATP. something like that then lets you then look at where do I need to nutritionally support. So if you do something like throttling hard with MOSI and SLU, again, mitochondrial isn't very like commercialized, so it's not something that bodybuilders have anecdotal data on. But it'd be very interesting to see what happens having done a baseline check on mitochondria and then doing a ton of strategies to improve mitochondria number. What actually changes in the efficiency of the complexes if you're not supporting them? So I think we're getting into that position where we are able to do some level of metabolomics, which is basically looking at metabolism, specifically towards the mitochondria, like the organic acid testing that we've had with functional medicine and practitioners. We're now able to get a little more nitty gritty towards, well, how are the complexes of mitochondria operating? So, most definitely, like baseline B complex, an activated B complex, that was one thing. Like when we developed ours, most people just buy a regular B complex. Whilst that's okay, most of them are just the hydrochloride versions that then have to be phosphorylated. And that's probably why in the past a lot of people bought like B complex effervescent tablets that turned your pee bright yellow because you're just peeing out the B vitamins. B vitamins are useful in that they are water soluble. So if you have an abundance of them and you don't utilize them, toxicity risk wise, there are toxicity risks. So most definitely don't think taking as much B complex as possible is the best outcome, because you have toxicity problems from B6, B2, and B1. And then obviously too much folate and B12 can cause their own problems with methylation. That you want to make sure that they do have the phosphorylated forms like pyridoxine 5-phosphate or riboflavin 5-phosphate. You have methylfolate, methyl B12, which are the more bioavailable forms, or at least some form of active folate like folinic acid also, or adenylyl, cobalamin. Just don't look more so towards just cobalamin by itself, or hydroxycobalamin, or folic acid, which would be the synthetic form. Especially with MOSI, we touched on it briefly last time. MOSI inhibits folate reductase. So it inhibits how your body produces folate, which is what creates some level of stress to improve mitochondria efficiency and function. So if we're chronically using MOSI over 6 to 8 weeks, and all of a sudden you start having issues with mood or sleep or estrogen clearance because now you're not producing folate properly, that can be a hidden side to thinking, well, MOSI looks amazing from someone talked about it and it improves mitochondria number and it improves glucose oxidation. So I'm going to take 1 milligram of MOSI every day. I'm going to load 5 milligrams per week. And you don't know about this hidden underlying biochemical thing that occurs with MOSI, which is your folate metabolism. So I think like the whole thing here is it's making sure like you know the ins and outs of what you're doing, of what's the cause and effect, and what are some of the things that can go wrong with doing it. And once you understand all that, you then can put those strategies in place rather than blindly doing something. It has some benefit and then all of a sudden it causes dysfunction. And the dysfunction is probably not worth ever doing it in the first place.
It's funny because it took us almost 20 years since the internet really blew up the fitness industry and made it accessible to everybody. It took 20 years for us all to basically agree that with anabolic steroids and traditional bodybuilding drugs, we really need to understand how they're working, what's going on under the hood. We need regular blood work. We need to assess individual tolerance. And now we all accept that. And as soon as we accepted that, we have this whole category where we don't really have access to the testing yet. And we just said, cool, give me all this shit. So it's like, well, guys, the same thing applies. And it's just history repeating itself. So and unfortunately, I hate to sound like it's doom and gloom, but sheer probability states that at least one of these ultra promising compounds 20 years from now, we're going to look back on it and be like, oh shit, I wish I didn't do that so much. So stuff will come up. So it's going to be more beneficial to be a little bit cognizant of that possibility now. Now, I want to touch on something that you mentioned before, and it's something that I don't see, it's not really a focal point of the content that you produce for educational purposes, but it is something I know that you're very knowledgeable about. And we already touched on it a little bit, but it's training styles and how they impact mitochondria and how that can be used as not only a prophylactic strategy, but something to actually push forward in overall results, getting you to where you want to be, being leaner, healthier, feeling better, more just cognizant ability, everything like that. You mentioned how your wife has switched over to like high rock style training. I know you still do more of like a hypertrophy or bodybuilding approach to your training, but you're also getting back into kickboxing. Would the average bodybuilder benefit from phases of not training like a bodybuilder, not just for a health span, but would that push them potentially closer to their bodybuilding goals to periodize their training to do something that might be a little bit more beneficial for different energy systems?
Yeah, I guess I started bodybuilding in line with kickboxing. So as a kid, I was a martial artist. I fell in love with bodybuilding as part of rehab of my ankle, and then I thought I couldn't kickbox with my PhD, so I set the challenge of doing a bodybuilding show. And that sort of then led me down a path of, wow, this is really fun getting on stage, and sort of pushed me down the rabbit hole of moving away from martial arts into bodybuilding. When we look at what tends to happen if we get stuck in this sort of chronic bodybuilding pattern is we develop, depending on how you train, whether it's sort of more freestyle or machine based, you're going to develop different biases in terms of stability and functionality. You're going to see changes in your hip mobility, which can be a good and a bad thing from a longevity perspective. So you only have to look at a lot of old school bodybuilders who done heavy squats, heavy leg presses, who need hip replacements because the mobility of the hip joint was always in that fixed plane. They never done anything to functionally improve the strength or the stability around the hip joint, and over time the hip just wears away. Could a bodybuilder benefit from doing more like hybrid based training? I guess if we look at what drives muscle mass, we're now at a relatively good global understanding of metabolic tension being, muscular tension being what drives it, as opposed to metabolic acidosis or anything like that internally. That those changes from a metabolite perspective are a consequence of doing the mechanical loading. So if we can still train to an extent where we're causing mechanical tension, whether that is with either low volume, high intensity, or moderate volume, moderate intensity, or again high volume, low intensity. I think it comes down to, from what I understand, and I'm not the best sort of physiological or biomechanical expert, only from what I've personally experienced, is it really comes down to your ability to generate what they consider those effective reps. Doing low volume, high intensity, so like heavy sets of like 4 to 6 reps, generates high mechanical tension quite quickly. So then the ability to progress that is probably less mentally demanding. So I found for myself personally, having to do like a set of 5 or 6, you look at a number and you think, oh, this isn't too hard. You know, doing a hack squat for 4 or 5 reps, you'll get under like 8 or 9 plates, but like reverse banded. Whereas historically, if I done things like Widowmakers, so again, we're probably all showing our age, but Dante's sets of 20, they were horrific. And then if someone really didn't like you coaching you, you'd have a Widowmaker, and then you'd have rest pause after the Widowmaker up to like a 30 rep set. They were absolutely horrific. Could I say that a Widowmaker of 20 reps, which still had to be high mechanical tension, you still had to pick a weight that basically you're going to probably fail around 11 or 12 reps, and you were rest pause into 20. And then if someone really didn't like you, you're going from 20 to 30 after deep, deep breaths and rests to get you there. When we start going beyond that level of failure in one camp, you're creating too much nervous system fatigue, which then hinders your ability to recover for the next session. And then on the other side, it's creating a high level of stimulus with high effective reps set to set within that rest pause. The way I've sort of found with training is it really becomes an inter-individual response to training. I don't think, like with anabolics, there is no like correct cycle setup. And the same with training. I don't think there's the right way of saying to someone, this is how you have to train. It very much becomes, a trial and error of what suits your body. As I got older, doing like reps and reserve, that changed like my risk tolerance towards doing silly things with DC and doing progressive overload where you're chasing the logbook, where you're then having to stop short of those very risky reps. But the sets were still combinations between low volume, 4 to 6 reps, and 8 to 12. I personally started to move away from like 15 to 20 rep sets. But like what you asked about energy systems, we change energy systems depending on what threshold we're tapping into and what's the metabolic demand for that. I do think that a lot of bodybuilders would probably benefit from, again, depending on recovery capability, especially with legs, doing bouts of like high intensity cardio, like Wingate sprints. I've seen you do it on your story, and that are like absolutely brutal cardio that have metabolic benefits towards mitochondrial efficiency. You're having to operate at such a high heart rate that from an anaerobic perspective, you're now improving aerobic conditioning and especially oxidative phosphorylation to keep up with energy demand. So you can no longer rely on fatty acids. It's straightforward glucose and feeding into the mitochondria as quick as possible to get ATP up with creatine. That doing things like that, as uncomfortable as they are, the end result is comforting, that it improves your arterial flexibility, it improves your blood pressure, it improves your ability to switch between energy states, between fatty acids and glucose. That not being lazy and using these as strategies, like if you're in an off season, you're like, well, I don't need to do cardio because I'm in my off season, I don't unnecessarily waste energy. You have to view it as the other strategy of, well, this has cardiometabolic benefits. It's improving my mitochondrial efficiency. It's improving my blood pressure. So whilst you might have an association that cardio is for prep or for fat loss, more hybrid style training plays off both functionally and metabolically. Even thinking back in 2022, my second last prep, Aaron Casely, who was my like training coach. Aaron's a well-known like osteopath. He was Tom Stoltman's last coach there at the start of the year. Aaron had me every Wednesday do like a hybrid. He used to just put it down as like a hybrid workout, but it was like crazy things like sled pushes, sled pulls, ball slams, stuff that I enjoyed doing from like when I done cardio conditioning with kickboxing. But like I remember asking, like, why do we have that in? This was even in the off season. And he said, well, there's no point in having all that muscle mass, but you've got no sort of athleticism surrounding, no functionality. So again, core strength. Doing aside from the sled pushes and pulls, he'd put wing gates or he'd put in sprints on the Stairmaster. They were things that I hated doing at the time, but I knew would have benefits the next day and the day after. That you can't get just stuck into this, get in the gym, beat the logbook, leave. That essentially is what bodybuilding at its core is. But if it's always, like I said, surrounding like a leg press, a hack squat, chest press, a row machine, there's never any functionality surrounding that. That strength that you develop is in a single plane, unless you're doing things like free bar squats or rows or bench press, which then increases injury risk. But you want to have a good blend with your training between functional strength, where it's not just loading in one plane. That, again, when you look at some of the high level bodybuilders who have tore triceps or tore knee ligaments or knee tendons, they've been from slips or falls where they've grabbed something. The tendon isn't used to moving in that plane and just shears because it doesn't have the strength for that functional movement.
Mhm.
So I do think there is benefits to having a more hybridized approach to your training. Maybe towards like the end of your off season, as you head into prep, might be a way to sort of segue it in, because you're then going to get ready for more conditioning with cardio and your prep. But there are just only benefits, in my view, from having that style of training, thinking, okay, cardio is not really going to be conducive to muscle mass.
I'll agree with that tenfold. It's just kind of like the old look back at, and I'm a huge Branch Warren fan, but I feel like every Branch Warren injury during his peak was from like a banister or a staircase or a parking lot, or I think a horse one time, but never the gym. So as much as people like to get on Branch for his training, never once got hurt at the gym, just got hurt by a bunch of random stuff outside of the gym. Now, before we wrap up, I do want to swing back to something that we mentioned before, because I think our training discussion can be we can take a step back and look at it through a broader scope. And we spoke about it on the podcast earlier, and we spoke about it a little bit before we started recording, and that's just AMPK versus mTOR. And we were discussing how people that are coming from a more bodybuilding background are consistently stuck in that mTOR pathway, which might be taking them to their goal, but it's also taking them in a lot of directions they don't want to be going. And it's funny because on the other side, in the biohacking longevity world, so many of these peptides and so many of these approaches and recovery modalities are driving AMPK. So you have the complete opposite problem. They're stuck in AMPK, which is taking them towards their goals, but then also taking them in other directions. And I recently found that when I kind of shut down most of my excessive AMPK stimulus, because I figured, all right, well, I'm 40. I don't want to get really, really big, but I'd like to put on a little bit more size. Let me kind of shift my just approach to stuff in general a little bit. After being in a constant AMPK stimulus, fairly constant, I was trying not to be, but too much over the course of the last year or so, I blew up. Like, I've been putting on muscle faster than I have since I was like 25 years old. Not too much, because I'm trying to regulate it, but I just kind of like had this amazing response by switching. But that was probably because I was too AMPK dominant going into it. In closing, how important is it for all of us, regardless of the goal, to be at least cognizant that we should spend some time in each? How often should we be going back and forth?
And I think you really painted two good pictures there. So we got the classic bodybuilder who's chronic mTOR, protein shakes every 2 or 3 hours, high leucine threshold, high muscle protein synthesis, cellular replication is increased from IGF-1 and anabolics, etc. And then you've got perhaps a biohacker or that longevity sphere that is restricting protein, so the bare minimum in terms of like protein leveraging and protein hypothesis. And then they're restricting methionine, they're restricting leucine. They are doing things like fasting, extended water fasts, taking compounds that activate AMPK or reduce mTOR, like berberine, metformin, all these sort of longevity aspects, even to the point of using like rapamycin to blunt mTOR chronically pharmaceutically. If we go in either camp, full tilt, you're just chronically bodybuilding up until like you're 60, 70. One side, having higher levels of muscle mass is a predictor of longevity, because we have more what they call metabolic currency. So we have more muscle that can utilize more glucose, can store more fatty acids, and etc. We're performing cardiovascular activity with training and everything. So there's a level of balance that you could maybe attribute there. And then the other side, the ones who are leveraging AMPK all the time are probably probably in a position of like longevity, but if they're not focusing on muscle protein accretion or preserving muscle protein in their body or strength, then that AMPK over time, that chronic AMPK, probably doesn't serve them from a longevity aspect because of lower levels of muscle mass, lower abilities to utilize glucose and fatty acids from obviously lower muscle mass overall. Like you said, I think as we get older, we still want to ensure that we have periods of muscle protein synthesis where we're maintaining the muscle mass that is relatively suited to our physiology. So what we're maintaining naturally, understanding that as we age, muscle protein synthesis and potentially the absorption of amino acids at the gut slows down, or our gut microbiome changes, and that interferes protein absorption. There's pros there that we still want to ensure that we have periods of muscle protein synthesis from a longevity and strength aspect. But on the other side, we then want to make sure that as we age, we're buying ourselves time. So we're slowing down cellular replication. So when people often talk about when you're on Earth, you've got a finite amount of time. That is basically like your biological clock. When your cells reach the point, the Hayflick limit, which is what it's called, where the cell can only multiply or divide so many times, once it reaches that limit, that's it. You run out of replications and it's game over. Being in an AMPK state or like that rest and digest, you're slowing down that replication. So you're gaining yourself time. When you're younger, you can probably afford to speed things up a bit. You're young and eager and you want more muscle mass and you want that, like what you said, that sort of visual appeal and having, all the girls, hopefully. When you get older, what you've built from those years of training and potential anabolics, you've probably surpassed what you could have developed naturally. And you've probably leveraged in some way of being able to maintain quite a lot of muscle mass naturally with diet and training and intelligent recovery. I'd still probably follow the approach, like as you age, that you probably want to spend 3 or 4 days in an mTOR or an anabolic state where you're progressively overloading, you're training the gym, and then use the other 3 days to be in a more rest and digest, lower carbohydrate intake, potentially lower protein, or even fasting, where you're just giving cellular processes a chance to flip the switch over to the other side, allow cellular debris to clear out, give your gut a rest that it can focus on digesting what's in your gut as opposed to consistently moving things along with incorrect absorption. So I think there is a balance. Scientifically, I don't think we have a number yet, but I think from a common sense perspective and what you see best of both worlds, and like bodybuilders who are in their 60s and 70s who have lived this lifestyle, who may have been natural athletes, versus the longevity sphere who are doing chronic fasting. I think if we look at a lot of like top level people within the biohacking sphere, they're more so leaning back into bodybuilding, in that this chronic AMPK state is probably not the best thing longevity wise, that it's a blend of both.
It's the answer that we hate to hear, but logically we know it's the right one. Balance is key with pretty much everything. Dean, thank you so much for your time. Hell of an episode. A lot of stuff people can take from this, and I think this will open a lot of people's eyes to some stuff that can really be helpful for their endeavors moving forward. For anybody that's living under a rock, if they want to follow any more of your information, any of your content, maybe pick up some of those supplements we talked about for the potential post-SLU therapy through supplement needs, what are the best ways to find you and your companies?
So my main handle would be Instagram, DeanSTM. We have our company, supplementneeds.co.uk. So if they want to check out our products, Dr. Dean will save 10% off. And then I have an education platform where I do like deep dives, like the SLU we talked about, looking at like the pharmacology and the medicinal chemistry sides. So that's sneducation.co.uk.
Awesome. Dean, thank you again. This has been the DDT Method Podcast.